It's kinda weird how people can feel so sympathetic for video game characters. Perhaps that might have something to do with us being sad and pathetic, or it could just go to show how much games can impact us. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, I want to talk about some emotional stuff in games, specifically tragic characters. Any video game character that has experienced multiple bad or downright depressing events that I can't help but feel a little sorry for. There'll be quite a few spoilers on this list, since a lot of games typically don't bring up sad backstories or whatever until the moment is right, so be forewarned. Something else to mention is that some characters here do, of course, go through some pretty terrible stuff, but I don't want you to misinterpret me ranking another character above them as me saying that their hardships matter less. I'm mainly ranking these entries based on how much I have to say about them, among other factors. I can't really think of much else to say, so let's just have a chill time and get started. Something I really like about the Asterisk bosses in Bravely Second is that they've all been through some pretty rough stuff, which made them side with Kaiser Oblivion in the first place. The real tragic character of this series, though, would have to go to Luggo after playing Bravely Default 2. But yeah, in all seriousness, I really like the boss lineup. It might be smaller than the first games, but the characters have given a lot more depth. But the real question is, who could I possibly choose for this spot? I mean, Geist and Revenant seem like an obvious choice. However, I'm actually going to go with someone different. Minette. Okay, so I know it's really weird that I go with the stupid cat person over literally everyone else, but trust me, just let me explain myself for a second here. Minette is pretty unsuspecting at first. Imagine everything wrong with Japan and their weird interests wrapped up into one person, and, well, you have your character. Like the other Asterisk wielders, she works under Kaiser Oblivion and you have multiple encounters with her. She acts like a cat, makes stupid cat puns, has an affinity for felines in general, has a pet lion, and references the fine literature of Dr. Seuss. The absolute perfect mix of based and cringe. But Luggo, how am I supposed to feel sympathy for a cat girl? Well, to answer that question, she's against the whole world for a good reason, and it's not pretty. During her second fight, she says a ton of sad and even mildly disturbing stuff about how she was horribly mistreated and had weird experiments performed on her. As for what she's referring to, Professor Norzen decides to clarify that after the fight. So basically, a lot of backstories in the game involve this great plague and... Oh, can you please? Essentially, the world was nearly doomed because of this plague, and Norzen and his fellow researchers were desperately working to find a cure. One of these researchers was Minette's mother. She had been doing her own research and eventually found that cats, of all things, had some sort of resistance to the disease. So, she started conducting experiments on herself. And eventually, she stopped limiting those experiments to just her. She started doing these tests on her newborn daughter. Later on, she did pass away, but a cure was eventually developed inside Minette and then extracted, though it certainly wasn't pleasant and it had long-lasting effects on her. It explains why she's so in sync with cats and acts like one to begin with. This kind of stuff has always really disturbed me. It just clicked with me more than the other Asterisk wielders. If you really think about it, she's the living embodiment of that "thank you doctor for turning my son into a cat girl" meme. That's just a little screwed up. The only reason why she's at the bottom is that there isn't a whole lot of detail about Minette's involvement with the plague aside from this cutscene, and plus, this whole story does have a nice happy ending to it. It's actually kinda heartwarming how Minette was able to contribute so much to the world, though it doesn't take away the pain. Okay, so the mere fact that I'm mentioning Sam and Max here might sound really stupid. Like, what am I? Some 13-year-old moron who tries to insist that some character has a sad and tragic backstory when in reality I'm greatly over-exaggerating it? I mean, maybe a little. However, surprisingly, there's a character from this series that wouldn't be out of place in this video. In Sam & Max The Devil's Playhouse, there's a narrator who will say some bigly block bullcrap nonsense at the start of each episode and generally contributes little to the story. Now, I could just tell you that he's the icon for my Discord server, and that'd be tragic enough, but I should probably go into a bit more detail than that. Anyway, he doesn't really have much relevance until the final episode of the season. For some context, at the end of episode 4, Max's psychic powers go haywire and he transforms into a giant Lovecraftian monster and he goes on a rampage throughout the city. At the start of episode 5, the narrator says that one of the characters is going to betray Sam and Max. I don't really get how they're going to use that, but sure, I'll bite. I didn't really sign up for any twist villains and I have no idea what they're cooking up here. Though due to the focus of this entry so far, I'm pretty certain that you can guess who the traitor is. But anyway, once Sam and a few others get inside of Max, he eventually makes his way to Max's brain, where the narrator gives you one more chance to guess who the traitor is, when suddenly, he's interrupted by Sam. That's right, it was the narrator. The narrator was the villain all along. Holy moly! But that doesn't make any sense. The narrator is just the narrator. He's not a real character in the game's story, is he? Well, he's actually Max's superego, the part of your conscience that influences you to act morally and such. To make things simple, say if you feel guilty about doing something bad, that's your superego at work, if I'm not mistaken. Now consider the fact that this is Max's superego and you'll see the problem here. If you somehow don't know, Max is a character who's absolutely insane and does all sorts of crazy and morally reprehensible things. For comedic effect, of course. The only reason why he's even allowed to be within 10 miles of a dangerous weapon is because this series is not serious at all. Max's superego saw him acting like this, and he could never do anything about it despite his role. I have no idea how Max was able to completely ignore his own superego, but he somehow found a way. Since he's practically had to live in torment, being unable to do anything, he's completely fine with Max getting killed. I know that this series is completely off the walls crazy and such. However, I think that it's a really interesting idea to have a character like this. He feels like the perfect villain for a game like this, and it's a great twist too. And near the end of the episode, Max tries to help everyone escape from his body before he inevitably gets killed, for once actually doing something good. Seeing Max make a selfless decision for once, the narrator decides to try and save Max and get rid of his tumor while letting the rest of the group escape. However, he doesn't make it in time and Max gets killed, before getting replaced by Max from an alternate timeline. Yeah, I mean, you can't really end a game like this on something so depressing. I mean, it was doing well with not having major tonal whiplashes up until this point. Though, there's one more thing I'd like to mention that I don't think a single person has ever brought up. This Max still has a superego that has absolutely no control over him. Has anyone ever thought about that before? Wow. I don't know what to say. That just sucks. Okay, so this is where that warning I gave at the beginning of the video was specifically referring to. I'll explain why this character is on the lower end of the list later, so please don't get the wrong idea. Anyway, let's talk about Yume Nikki. It's quite possibly the most well-known and influential RPG Maker game of all time, and for good reason. You go around exploring the dreams of a character named Manotsuki. There's no dialogue at all. You just look at stuff, find effects, listen to serene music, and then come across horrors unlike anything you've seen before. While it's pretty tame for the most part, Yume Nikki occasionally has some pretty questionable imagery as well as some creepy in-game events. And considering that this is a dream world of some girl, well, it really makes you wonder. There's some objects that look very funny, and art that looks yeah, so basically a lot of people have come to the conclusion that Manotsuki was probably raped. Now, that is quite the lofty assumption here, but to be fair, there's plenty of evidence to back up that theory. The most infamous thing in this game, Uboa, has a rare chance of appearing in this house, and once he does show up, you're stuck in there and you have to touch him. Once you do touch him, he brings you to this area with art that can be interpreted as someone doing something they really shouldn't be doing. And just about everyone universally agrees on this theory being true, though there's probably more to it than what I just mentioned. Like, it might as well be confirmed at this point. Even if that somehow isn't what actually happened, you can still tell Madatsuki has been through some tough times. She refuses to leave her home and has some pretty terrible nightmares. Something traumatic had to have happened here, it's just we don't know all the details. Also, at the very end of the game, once you collect all the effects, she jumps off of her apartment's balcony committing suicide. So with all that said, the reason why she's lower on the list is because this isn't outright confirmed, and plus the game doesn't give you much detail on these terrible events due to the lack of dialogue. I personally like it that way. I think leaving all this surreal stuff to interpretation works well for a game like this, so like I said, don't take this ranking the wrong way. I love it when games that don't focus much on their stories have little details about certain characters or events hidden away for you to find. One of my favorite examples of this has to be in A Hat in Time. There are a bunch of these strange time rift levels that you can find tucked away in the game's missions, each of which have a set of collectibles in them. These collectibles are images that, when you gather them all, form into a little picture book giving you some backstory on the current area you're in and the characters that inhabit it. They're all really interesting, and I always tried my best to complete each of them. And plus, for areas like the Subcon Forest, well, you really wonder what happened there to make it into the place it is today. It's a dark, desolate forest with weird-looking creatures, talking nooses. This entry was not placed very well, and it's all governed by the Snatcher. He tries to capture anyone stumbling around in the forest in order to force them into signing contracts that probably end with you giving away your soul, or something like that. Buddy, I'm a YouTuber. If you wanted my soul that badly, then you're way too late. But yeah, I really like him. He's loud, deceitful, and most importantly, funny as heck. But he wasn't always like this. He actually used to be quite different. Long ago, the Subcon Forest was actually a peaceful kingdom ruled by the beautiful Queen Vanessa, who was in a close relationship with an unnamed prince. However, one day Vanessa completely misinterpreted an interaction between the prince and some other woman. After seeing this, she grows bitter and kinda sorta has the prince locked away to rot in her dungeon and plunges the whole kingdom into darkness. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that Vanessa is a whore. As for what became of her, we don't talk about that. The prince, on the other hand, suffered a horrible fate. It's made pretty clear that after being imprisoned for so long, the prince eventually turned into the Snatcher. And, well, it's had quite the effect on him. It's weird because he's really funny, but at the same time, it's also pretty screwed up knowing what he's been through. And need I remind you that this whole calamity was caused because of a handshake? Vanessa, really? My blatant sexism becomes more and more justified every day. But yeah, I hope you understand why I love little stories like this. I love the party members in Dragon Quest XI. Like, they all start out pretty good and entertaining, and they're all pretty useful in battle too. But as if they weren't good enough, they also get some great character development. My favorite character was Sylvando, but from both a gameplay and story perspective, it was Rab. Rab is an old man in a Japanese RPG, and sure, that does raise some major red flags, but trust me, cliches aside, he's great. He's first met in the middle of a fighting tournament where he does Drac Squat and leaves it all up to his partner, Jade. After a while, though, he realizes that he's come face to face with the Luminary, and now all of a sudden he decides to join you. The thing is, Rab is actually related to the Luminary. In fact, he's his grandfather. He brings the party back to the ruins of Dundrasil, where he tells you everything that happened to it several years ago. He used to be the king of Dundrasil, and his daughter had given birth to a child who bore the mark of the Luminary, a hero who'd one day save the world. During all this, however, tragedy struck and the whole kingdom was attacked and destroyed by monsters. He managed to escape, along with King Cornelian's Vixen's daughter, Jade, and they both just presumed that everyone else was dead. His daughter, son-in-law, and grandchild all just gone in such a short moment. So he's pretty much spent the last decade or so wandering around the world assuming that everyone in his family is gone. That's pretty sad on its own, and of course, watching your own kingdom crumble is horrible. However, what really puts him on this list is one moment in particular. In the definitive edition of the game, they added a bunch of new short scenarios for each party member, excluding Veronica and Serena in the middle of the game. After a story moment so shocking that I talked about it in my Insane Moments list, Rab finds himself completely lost in some weird realm. Eventually, he finds himself reliving his old life as the King of Dungersville, making tough decisions for the kingdom and watching his family grow. Except this time there's one major difference. Dungersville never gets destroyed. He's able to live his perfect life, one filled with happiness and peacefulness. He even gets to watch his grandson grow up, which obviously he never got to see beforehand. But later, Rab realizes what he was doing before all this happened. He's in a state of meditation, training to become powerful enough to stop the Lord of Darkness, Mordegon. All of this that he's currently experiencing is essentially just a dream, a trial of sorts for him. But he's given the option to either leave it or stay living like this forever if he wants to. This legitimately almost made me cry, seeing Rab not have to suffer and instead have his life play out how it should have. And it wasn't the fact that he was going to have to wake up from all this that got to me. It was mainly about how wholesome this entire moment is in comparison to the tragedy that took everything away from him. However, he realizes that leaving all this behind is part of his training, and decides that he needs to be responsible and help save the world. I already thought Rab was great beforehand, but that segment made me care for him so much more. I get that a lot of the other characters in the game go through some rough crap too, but this dude is in a whole nother league, for me at least. Okay, so real quick, I'd like to thank AI, the Somnium Files, for delaying this list. I mean, the game's great, don't get me wrong, but it was kinda long, and while I did like it at first, I didn't really get all too into it until about 10 hours in. It was then that the story, and especially the characters, finally clicked with me. In this game, you play as Kaname Date, a detective investigating a mysterious murder. It has a couple of branching paths throughout it, and all sorts of different and weird things happen in each route. And obviously, since this is a murder mystery game, there's bound to be some pretty good material for this list. I originally thought about putting Mizuki on the list because, you know, her mother was kinda the person who got killed. Not to mention, we can't let the victim's daughter join the investigation to try and put her mind at ease. Oh, but the Minecraft streamer? Oh yeah, she's gotta come. But there isn't a whole lot to say about her aside from what I just mentioned, for this list at least. After thinking about it some more, I realized that Hitomi deserved the spot. Hitomi is a character who's kinda in the background for most of the game. She's Iris's mother, and her right arm is disabled, and you don't really get much more information than that about her until later. You'll find out some more interesting things about her, like how she had met and started dating a man who went by the name of Falco, who became a father figure to Iris. Falco is also a nickname used by a prison inmate by the name of Number 89, another character that you know little about. However, you get to learn a lot more about her once you finally unlock one of the last routes in the game. She's brought into interrogation to be questioned about this mysterious dead body that looks oddly similar to Iris, and eventually Date syncs with her to dig up more information. And what you find out is, well, let's face it, you know where this is going. Several years earlier, Hitomi was friends with another character you hear a lot about, Rinju, and a girl named Monika. Monika had a child with Congressman So Sajima and wanted to go talk to him about it, but So wanted nothing to do with her anymore. Just as she began to walk away, she's attacked and killed by Saito Sajima, So's son. Hitomi and Rinju had Monika hold onto a GPS tracker just in case if something went wrong during the interaction with So, and when they follow it, they find out that So had ordered the Kumakuras, a Yakuza gang, to dispose of Monika's dead body to cover for his son. Rinju and Hitomi decide to preserve the body in the Okira cold storage warehouse that Rinju's father operated, the same body that Date eventually finds and mistakes for Iris. However, there's still one issue. Monika had already given birth, and with no other options, Hitomi decides to raise her daughter all by herself. This daughter, of course, is Iris. It kind of explains why she and Hitomi don't look alike. After several years of raising her, though, though, things began to look up for Hitomi. She met Falco, who was previously mentioned, and despite not being married, he was essentially part of the family. Falco, however, had ties with the Kumakura gang as an assassin, and just as he wanted to go clean, the leader of the gang, Rohan, decides that Hitomi and Iris will be his final target. Keep in mind, Rohan didn't know that Falco was close to them. If you're wondering, I don't know what the exact details were, but I think Rohan had figured out that Hitomi knew about Monika's corpse and he wanted to get rid of her for So's sake. Rohan eventually goes to kill Hitomi himself, and while Falco tries to defend her, Hitomi gets shot in the middle of the scuffle, which is why her arm is the way it is now. And wow, after all of that, I still initially thought about skipping out on her and giving this entry to an entirely different character. Like, man, one of her friends died, she can't tell her daughter that they aren't actually related, and just as she finally has something good happen in all this mess, that gets taken away from her as well. And despite all of this, she's still a relaxed, encouraging, and polite character. I'm very glad that I didn't make the mistake of not including her on here. That would have been really bad. After that trial ranking video, I'm kinda all Danganronpa'd out. Perhaps it's for the best that my opinion on the series has been solidified. Doesn't mean I'll stop talking about it though. A funny thing, I've had this countdown idea ever since I played the first game, and I always thought Chihiro would be a good fit for the list, but I made sure to wait and play the other games just in case if someone else would take that spot. So anyway, I think that, unfortunately, a lot of people can relate with Chihiro. She's a freaking weakling with self-esteem so low that 15-year-old Twitter users would be impressed. She has no balls whatsoever. Now, she's great with technology and programming, yet regardless, isn't very happy with herself. You have the talent to make the most complex algorithms and stuff, yet you still aren't proud enough of yourself to boast about it even a little bit. And you're telling me that this is one of our killing game participants. She has to survive, locked up in a school with a bunch of other people who are desperate to escape and help the group solve murders when the time comes. I am pretty sure that this will not end well. In Chapter 2, Monokuma decides to introduce a new motive to get the killing game rolling. This motive is that if nobody is killed within 24 hours, he's going to reveal everyone's worst, most embarrassing secrets. And later, Chihiro ends up being the victim of the second case. The first death in the game that actually got to me. I honestly thought she'd survive, you know, to subvert expectations, but no. Anyway, a lot of this case revolves around the locker room, since that's the crime scene. Of course, there's a boys' locker room and a girls' locker room with corresponding locks. But after some contradictions between the two rooms start popping up, Kyoko decides to call for a quick recess to unveil a detail that'll completely alter the course of the trial. And well, this might get a bit touchy, but remember what I said earlier? She has no balls whatsoever. Yeah, I lied. Chihiro was actually a guy cross-dressing as a girl this whole time. Remember that motive I mentioned earlier? Yeah, this was the secret Monokuma was going to reveal about Chihiro. It's so weird how inconsistent he is with these because Makoto's was so much more tame in comparison. Anyway, knowing that his secret might finally come out, the previous night Chihiro had met up with Mondo to train and become stronger. His whole life, Chihiro saw himself as a complete weakling, so much so that he had to hide his true identity. However, when this secret was at risk at being revealed, instead of freaking out or planning a murder, he actually decided to let that encourage him to finally become stronger. Mondo, unfortunately, had his own struggles, and he didn't handle them as well, leading him to kill Chihiro in a panic. But like, that's simultaneously extremely depressing, yet really encouraging. He put himself down all of his life for being weak, but eventually decides to finally confront that issue to become a better person. Yet when he finally gets the chance to change, he gets killed. I already discussed this in my trial ranking video, but I absolutely adore Case 2 for this reason. How Mondo and Chihiro deal with their struggles differently, how Chihiro is physically weak but mentally strong and Mondo is the complete opposite. And while I don't want to get too preachy here, in a day and age where it seems like everyone hates themselves for reasons that they shouldn't, a story about a person in the same situation growing past their inner struggles instead of letting it hold them back is fantastic. It's a tragic death, yes, but I also think the entire ending of this chapter is extremely inspirational. Who actually gives a crap about the stories in the Resident Evil games. Like, they could be kind of interesting, but most of the time, they're just way too stupid to take seriously. Kinda funny considering the premise of these games involves some sort of horrifying zombie outbreak or something of the like. But I mean all of this in a good way. Like, they're dumb, however, they're still entertaining and have their charm. So you might be wondering why I just spent the last minute or so talking about Resident Evil if I was just going to say how dumb the plots can be. Well, truth be told, I just really wanted to make fun of them. So yeah, we're not actually going to talk about the series. Let's move on. Oh. So, in the remake of the first Resident Evil game, the developers added in some new things to catch veterans of the original game off guard. The most famous addition is Lisa Trevor. During certain parts of the game, you'll encounter this horrific abomination. Surprisingly, this is actually a person by the name of Lisa. She was the daughter of the architect who was contracted to build the current mansion you're in. This mansion was used as a facility by the Umbrella Corporation, who took in Lisa and her mother as test subjects for their twisted experiments. While her mother ended up dying before she got the chance to escape, Lisa ended up reacting differently to the virus she was injected with. She started developing unnatural strength and eventually lost her mind. Now she just wanders the mansion looking for her long-dead mother. Because of these tests, she's become unkillable and extremely dangerous. Anytime you encounter her, it's best to just avoid her at all costs since she's invincible and hits like a truck. But something strange is, she doesn't actually show up that often. You see her for like a whopping 10 seconds in the cabin, see her again in the caverns, and one last time in a crypt below the mansion where she finally finds her mother and then proceeds to jump presumably to her death. Altogether, this is probably less than 5 minutes of total screen time. They don't even play up her appearances that much. Like, she literally just appears in the caverns with no cutscenes at all, and in Chris's route, there's no indication that she's even there. The way they handled her appearances, along with figuring out what happened to her, makes her less scary and more disturbing and creepy. And in my opinion, those two aspects have a lot more staying power than scariness. The last scene of her jumping into the abyss, holding the skull of her deceased mother, is downright haunting. I know that there isn't a ton of detail surrounding her, so maybe you could make the argument that putting her this high is unjustified, but I don't know. I feel like how sparingly she's used is part of what makes her so interesting. The ambiguity of it all makes it even more disturbing in my opinion. In a series revolving around murder mysteries and such, it's not surprising that there are some pretty tragic moments in the Ace Attorney series. Like, it knows when to be silly, yet it also knows how to play things straight, which I really like. So, I think now is a better time than ever to talk about Godo. He serves as the prosecutor for the third game in the series, Trials and Tribulations. He's a laid-back guy with an unhealthy coffee obsession, so basically, it's really hard to not like him at least a little bit. Even though he's supposed to be a newcomer, he seems to have quite a bit of experience under his belt. Not only that, but he also holds some bitterness towards Phoenix. He doesn't really do anything unethical as a prosecutor, and he isn't outright rude to Wright, but you can tell that he holds some resentment towards him. He's shrouded in a lot of mystery, and it's not until you approach the end of the game that you learn more about him. Part of the game focuses on Phoenix's mentor, Mia Fey, and you get to play as her in her first 2 cases. The 4th case in the game is a flashback to her very first case several years beforehand. Accompanying her is Diego Armando, who looks awfully familiar. Oh my goodness, guys, I wonder who he is. While the two are able to find the potential culprit, Dahlia Hawthorne, they never actually get the chance to convict her since the trial ends abruptly after the defendant poisons himself. Off-screen after the trial, Diego interrogates Dahlia, but that hoe ends up spiking his coffee with poison that puts him into a coma. Dahlia does eventually get sentenced to death due to this crime as well as another. As for what became of Diego, he eventually woke up many years later with his vision severely harmed. But that's not the only thing he lost, because in that time, Mia had been murdered. That happened during the first game, when Phoenix was still just a rookie, and seeing this, Diego, now known as Godo, decides to hunt Phoenix down. The whole reason he became a prosecutor is so that he could defeat Phoenix as revenge for not being able to protect Mia. That's pretty spiteful for something Phoenix had no control over, but it doesn't end there. In the final case in the game, Maya is in severe danger due to a murder being planned against her by Morgan Fay. There are a ton of details to it, but basically it involved Dahlia being spirit channeled and coming back from the dead to kill Maya. However, there was one person who found out about the plan and threw a wrench into it, and they ended up stopping Dahlia before she got the chance to kill Maya. Though, this ended up killing the person who was channeling Dahlia, Misty Fay, Maya and Mia's mother. The whole case was about solving Misty's murder to begin with, and now you realize what the motive behind it was. But because of that, even after Dahlia is dealt with once and for all, the case still has to continue to find out who killed Misty. Maya has to testify, and she desperately tries to defend the culprit. And that's because all signs point to it being Godo. It becomes more and more clear over the course of the trial that he killed Misty, obviously to protect Maya, but a murder is still a murder. The thing is though, that Godo doesn't even outright say he was trying to protect Maya. He points out how he probably killed Dahlia sheerly out of revenge for all the crap she put him through. Not only that, but the whole time, he's clearly not trying very hard to defend himself. It's almost like he wants Wright to figure out the truth at this point. And he does, in one of the most legendary gaming moments of all time. At that moment, Godo finally realizes where he went wrong. He never moved on from Mia's death. He instead felt bitter and was stuck in the past. Phoenix, on the other hand, was able to pick up where she left off and continue her legacy. Godo doesn't try to make himself out to be a good person, even if he did save Maya's life, and that's one thing I really like about him, because despite what he's been through, he has done some unjustifiable things. Like I said, him being angry at Phoenix was completely unwarranted, so him admitting his mistakes is really nice to see. And sure, what the other characters went through is probably worse, but I put him higher mostly because I just like his character so much more. You see him so much that it's difficult not to get attached to him, and it hurts so much to see him go. It's hard to say whether or not this is a tragic send-off for him though. On one hand, he's convicted for murder, but on the other hand, he finally realizes his wrongdoings and moves on. It's a satisfying conclusion for him, and the series as a whole. The original trilogy, at least. At this point, I think most of us can agree that pretty much everyone on this list didn't deserve what happened to them. Number 1 is no different. However, he's a bit of a... I literally wrote different again. Number 1 is a bit of a special case. So anyway, let's talk about Lisa, yet again. There will be a point where I run out of lists to put this game on, I swear, but this next character absolutely deserved this spot. In a world like Lisa, pretty much everyone is suffering, and yet there's one character who somehow manages to suffer more than everyone else. You'll occasionally encounter a character named Rando, as well as his army. They're trying to maintain order in this mad post-apocalyptic world, and despite his intimidating appearance, Rando is actually a gentle and kind person. You'd expect someone like this to be a ruthless leader or the main villain, but ironically it's kind of the opposite. Considering the horrid stuff Brad does, it's more like he's the villain here. At the very end of the game, Brad invades Rando land and single-handedly kills Rando's entire army just to keep Buddy for himself in his own twisted view of saving her. Once he comes face to face with the big man himself, Rando seems to be familiar with Brad. He uses the exact same fighting style, has a weird stutter, and his face is beyond scarred. And at this point, some people probably caught on to Rando's true identity. I didn't though, because I'm stupid. At earlier points in the game, Brad has had flashbacks to certain parts of his life. One of the more notable ones was back whenever he was a martial arts trainer. He met a very timid kid named Dustin who wanted to learn to fight but didn't have any money, so out of kindness, Brad decided to teach him for free. Dustin pretty much became like a son to Brad, until one day a kid named Bernard invaded and destroyed Brad's dojo. Talk about a small world. Dustin tries to protect the dojo, but Bernard retaliates by cutting his face off. There's no telling where their relationship went from there, but Brad probably disowned him at this point. So now you realize who Rando is and how all of those little details tie together. Rando is able to survive his fight with Brad and then proceeds to protect Buddy from any danger. Buddy is on a quest of her own to kill all of Olaf's gang leaders, and she pretty much forces Rando to accompany her. She treats him like absolute garbage despite him helping out so much, and Rando repeatedly tries to get her to stop what she's doing, but she never listens. Rando eventually decides that protecting Buddy isn't worth it if she's going to cause so much violence, so he abandons her. However, he then somehow gets captured by Bolo and is used as a trap for Buddy. No matter what you do at this point, Rando always falls to his death. He dies just as he lived, being treated horribly. What makes Rando different from everyone else I've mentioned is that while all of the characters have had it really bad, Rando had things worse his whole life. And yet, despite that, he did everything he could to help other people, yet he arguably got treated worse than anyone else I've mentioned before. And plus, some of the other characters I mentioned, while tragic, did try to do some pretty awful things afterwards as some form of revenge. Rando, however, continued being selfless. I mean, I know every Elisa fan says this, but seriously, Rando did nothing wrong, bro. He was a generous, kind-hearted soul stuck in a cruel world of twisted-minded, perverts and stuff. If that isn't convincing enough that he deserves this spot, then I don't want to know what is. But anyway, that was depressing, and sad, and various other synonyms. I'm glad you all sat through till the end. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Luggo the Luggician, and thank you very much for watching.